Today, we'll move into the climactic section of the Olivet Discourse and to a topic that's all about having eyes for eternity. We're in the middle of a discourse that Jesus delivered to his men 36 hours before he died. He's seated on the Mount of Olives, which is why we call this teaching the Olivet Discourse, and he's explaining how the future events of the end times will play out in the response to questions asked by his disciple. Altogether, Jesus explained 4 things. When will the temple destruction take place, and what will be the signs of its coming destruction? What are the signs of Jesus' coming, and what are signs of the end of the age? And what events should not be considered signs of anything? The disciples asked their questions in a somewhat random order, so Jesus reordered his answers in a chronological sequence. First, what are not signs because they happen all the time? Then secondly, what are the signs of the end of the age? The signs of the end of the age happen over centuries, so they will be our first indications that the end is near. Next, Jesus gives the signs of his second coming, which happens at the very end of the age after the 7-year tribulation. Then Luke inserted a sidebar about the temple destruction between the signs of the end of the age and Jesus' return. Jesus gives us a footnote for all his answers. One final overreaching sign that starts and finishes the entire sequence of end times events. Matthew 24:32 through 35 says, "Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." Throughout this discourse, Jesus has been giving signs that announce certain events, like the end of the age or his return. But at the very end, he sums up everything with one major sign that will tell us when the end times are set to begin. And he also adds a promise to assure us that these events will complete as promised. He starts with a parable of a fig tree coming out of its dormant phase at the end of winter, when it appears dead because it has no leaves. It is not truly dead, of course, but to our eye it appears as good as dead, until the leaves emerge in spring. And when the leaves show up, we know that means summer is right around the corner, and fruit will be found on it soon. Jesus chose to use a fig tree for this parable because a fig tree is a classic representation of Israel in the Bible. For a time, Israel will appear lifeless because the nation will be outside its land for centuries, and many will conclude it's dead. But when Israel came back to life, so to speak, then we can know that the end times are approaching. In effect, Israel's return as a nation on the world stage is the first sign that the end has come. And I'm not just talking about the formation of the modern state of Israel in 1948. The establishment of the nation came about as a result of years of work by the Zionist Congress to establish the nation. The Zionist movement started at the end of the 19th century and continued through the first half of the 20th century. The 1948 Declaration of Independence merely formalized what had been already true for decades. Israel was back from the dead. He says that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. This promise has been a source of considerable confusion and misinterpretation in the church. There are 2 keys to properly interpreting Jesus' promise. First, Jesus said all these things he described would come to pass while this generation existed, not just some of the things he described. So, from the start of the Zionist movement in the late 1800s through the world wars and other signs of the 1900s and 2000s to the very end of tribulation at Jesus' return. And all these things must take place without this generation passing away. Clearly, Jesus isn't referring to a single human generation, for no human generation lasts that long. Which leads us to the second key to interpreting Jesus' words. We notice that he said this generation, not merely a generation. Jesus was referring to something specific, something he had already mentioned, the fig tree. The fig tree represents what Jesus means by generation. And we understand the meaning by looking at the Greek word in verse 34. The word can also be translated as family, kind, or tribe. So by the context, that's how we should interpret the word. Jesus was speaking of the entire nation as a new generation of Israel, not merely one birth generation. We know this by the context because of the parable of the fig tree, which we know represents Israel's re-emerging on the world scene. When we see the nation of Israel returning to life, a new generation of Jews living in the land, then we know the end is near. That's the promise Jesus is making here. Israel is God's clock, telling us that the end times events have started. And once that clock has started, there is nothing in the universe that can stop the events that follow. Jesus adds that heavens and earth shall pass away as a result of the end of times, but Jesus' word will not pass away. You can be sure that when you see Israel return, everything else Jesus said was coming and will in fact arrive. Never forget what is worthy of your dependence and trust and what is not. In times when your world is shaken or your peace is broken, when you feel like you're losing control, that's a great time to remember verse 35. The things of this world that we often trust in for security or stability only have the appearance of certainty. A stable job, a comfortable house, good health, or a secure retirement plan, even a civil society. All these things appear certain and sure until they aren't. And then we wonder, where can we find security in this world? The first and foremost sign is to know that when Israel returns, the end is coming, and that day has already come. Jesus says you only need to know one sign, really, because this one sign is enough to tell you that the end is near. Those who study prophecy carefully and think about it properly will be better prepared to live obediently. It's the same feeling you get when you look at the kitchen clock as a child and you realize your parents are due home any minute. You race to finish cleaning the kitchen, or you jump into bed or do whatever you know that they expected of you. Of course, you should have done these things earlier, but still it's better to have done it late than to have never done it at all. And because you don't want to be found lacking when they arrive, and because you can read a clock, you get ready. And that's another reason we study the prophecy, because it leads to a sense of urgency and to a fear of the Lord, which has its ultimately good purpose in causing us to obey Christ more fervently and more consistently. And it's all made possible because you learn how to read the clock, the signs that Christ gives us in prophecy. Matthew 24, 27, and 28 says, "For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." In describing his return to earth, Jesus describes his bright appearance in an otherwise pitch-black universe as like lightning. Lightning is fiercely bright, intense, and quick. In fact, we might say it's lightning fast. Jesus' return will not be like a slow landing of a helicopter settling down on a landing pad, but Jesus will flash across the sky like lightning. And notice he comes in a certain direction, from east to west, reflecting Jesus' movements at his second coming. When we learned in our Revelation study that Jesus' first appearing on earth will be at a place called Bozrah in southern Jordan, we learned that Bozrah is a southeast of Jerusalem. So as Jesus comes to earth, he moves from east to west like lightning. And as he moves, he leaves behind a corpse, because as Jesus returns, he's simultaneously saving some while destroying others. God calls the birds of earth to gather and eat the bodies of all those killed at Christ's return, which will be a great number. In Revelation 19, we're given the details. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried out with a loud voice, saying to all the birds which fly in mid-heaven, "Come, assemble for the great supper of God, so that you may eat the flesh of kings, and the flesh of commanders, and the flesh of mighty men, and the flesh of horses, and of those who sit on them, and the flesh of all men, both free men and slaves, small and great." Back in Matthew 24:31, we read how angels will gather the elect from the corners of the earth, bringing them to Jerusalem. This great assembling of believers must take place so that all are present at the inauguration of the kingdom. So these are apparently Jews and Gentiles. So while the unbelievers are being made corpse and left for birds, the believers are being escorted by angels to Jerusalem. Earlier, we learned about this group when we read a description of Jesus' return in Revelation 19. That third group are the saints of the church who accompany Jesus. And Paul mentions this moment also. 1 Thessalonians 3:13, so that he may establish your hearts without blame and holiness before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus with all his saints. Matthew 24:36 through 38 says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark." We know from this context that Jesus has abruptly transitioned to speaking of something entirely new and different. Jesus says this is a day that has no signs whatsoever, and in fact, the day is so lacking in advance, notice, that not even he knows it. Jesus is saying there is an event in God's plan for the end times, a day he calls it, which is absolutely has no advance warning, no signs at all. And the previous events, whether the destruction of the temple, of the end of the age, or even his return, have warning signs. But of that day, there will be no signs to anyone and no way to know it's coming. In verse 37, it says, "With the circumstances of the day," and by these circumstances we can see clearly it's not Jesus' second coming. Jesus gives us a reference point from the story of Noah. So what do we know about the days of Noah? First, Jesus said it was a time when life felt normal to the world and there was no sense of impending doom. Jesus says people were eating, which implies they were planting and harvesting, which means they expected the normal routines of life to continue. Secondly, they were drinking, which refers to the drinking at a party or feast or other festive occasion where people celebrate daily life. That suggests people had no reason to worry or to panic. More than that, it implies debauchery and excess, a world unafraid of God. Finally, Jesus said marriages were happening, and marriage is an inherently optimistic choice. People marry because they're looking to the future, to a life together, to making a family, having a home. So the world expected daily routines to continue, celebration, and to continue in a future that wouldn't change. We see Jesus talking a day very different than his second coming, because these circumstances are the complete opposite. Earlier we learned that Jesus returns at the end of a 7-year tribulation. And throughout those 7 years, the world will be rocked by signs that announce the return of Christ, And life during that time will be anything but ordinary. People will not be eating, drinking, and the like without worry. On the contrary, Revelation tells us seas are turning to blood, mountains are falling, and people are living in caves. So when Jesus says that day will come during a time like the days of Noah, he must be talking about a day other than his second coming. He's talking about a day that will surprise everyone, a day that has no warning. That's a different day, even though Jesus also refers to it as the coming of the Lord. It's a type of return, yet one that is different than the one that ends the age. It's a return to rescue the church, to bring us to heaven prior to the onset of the judgment of tribulation. It's similar to the way God protected Noah and his family, making a way of escape shortly before the floodwaters arrived. The world is in an upheaval, and if it seems like we'll never find our way back to normal, let me assure you the world will find a new normal. Jesus said they will. They will return to eating, drinking, marrying, and the like. They will return to optimism and an expectation of regular life again. The world will return to that attitude, but we cannot. The believer is on notice that normal is an illusion, and there are great and terrible things coming for the world. Maybe it starts tomorrow, or maybe it's 100 years away, but it's coming, and Jesus assures us of that. These are the days of Noah. So now it's not the time to pretend all is normal. Now is the time to prepare spiritually, speaking for what follows.